Well, welcome to the Trainer's Bullpen, where trainers in the law enforcement space come to hear the experts talk about their work, experience, and research into human performance, particularly as it relates to the critical aspects of training motor learning, adaptive decision-making, and professional policing skills. The purpose of the Trainer's Bullpen is to bridge the gap between law enforcement training and the findings of academic research and current pedagogical best practice. Our desire at the Trainer's Bullpen is to advance law enforcement training, to make research applied, and improve officer and public safety. The Trainer's Bullpen is a production of Raptor Protection, and I'm Chris Butler, your host. Today, it's my pleasure to welcome to the show Gareth Lock. Gareth is the founder of the Human Diver, an organization set up to deliver education and research into the role and benefit of applying human factors, non-technical skills, psychological safety, and just culture in sports, military, and scientific diving. Gareth has published the book Under Pressure and produced the documentary If Only, both focused on improving diving safety and performance by looking at incidents through the lens of human factors. He has also worked in non-diving environments, developing high-performance teams through the application of non-technical skills, psychological safety, and a just culture. He is currently undertaking a Master's of Science in Human Factors and Systems Safety, specifically focusing on the factors which enable storytelling following adverse events with a view to improving learning. Gareth, welcome to the Trainer's Bullpen, and thanks for taking the time today.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invite. And yeah, really looking forward to this. You come with a great reputation. That disarmed you, didn't it?
You did, yes. Yeah, I'm supposed to be thanking you, but I appreciate the comments. But I recently read a fascinating article that you wrote and linked to in LinkedIn, which you and I are connected on. And your article, Gareth, was titled "Near Misses: Were You Lucky or Were You Good?" And what really struck a chord with me about that article, Gareth, is coming out of 28 years of law enforcement, and then prior to that, 6 years in technical search and rescue. The issue of near misses and decision-making and risk assessments and learning from those types of events were very important. And as I mentioned to you in the preamble to the show, one of the things in law enforcement that's extremely common is for law enforcement officers and even frontline supervisors, when a high-risk type of call occurs and where there is a near miss, is the outcome or the quality of decision-making that everybody uses to evaluate did we make good decisions or not is the outcome. So if we have a successful outcome where nothing bad happened, then often we think that that means that we made excellent decisions. And so we often don't learn from the near misses. And your article really spoke to this issue quite in depth and importantly. So let's look at your article, Gareth. I what I'd like to do to start with is for you to define for us, though, what is a near miss? How is that defined in the literature?
So it's an interesting one. It's generally this bit that said something that could have happened but didn't, more through luck than judgment. So it's a fortuitous positive outcome that ends up as a successful piece. And the problem is that we judge those near misses as successes, and we don't look at how close they were in what was going on. And that leads us to a whole bunch of issues when it comes to learning. And there's a bunch of issues why we focus on the positive outcomes as well, which I'm sure we'll touch on as we go through this.
Okay, so what qualifies then as a near miss? Is there some sort of a measurement? So how would I know when I've had an incident where we would go, oh, that was definitely a near miss? Like, how do you measure that, and what meets the criteria for one?
From my perspective, I don't think there is one. What we can do, though, is that's like saying, is something safe or is something risky? We construct that sense, that meaning about what's going on, but we've got to reflect on it, because actually, if we just, as you talk about, do the backslapping, we end up with a positive outcome. It takes a lot of mental effort to look back and say, actually, was that a near miss? Because that dialogue often doesn't even happen, or not in an overt way anyway, because there is this huge focus on the positive outcomes. And I'm very much a sort of strong proponent of understanding systems thinking, that people behave in the way they're rewarded. So if you reward for getting a job done, you get a job done quickly, and there isn't any adverse outcome, slap on the back, off we go, and then we won't go and look for that. And if the sort of the leadership or the public don't ask the question about how can we learn from this, then actually there's not even an incentive to go and reflect. So you could almost say that it's really difficult to define what a near miss is in real time, unless you basically say, let's learn from success as well as failure.
Okay. And as you're talking, I was reflecting back before I joined law enforcement. I was in technical search and rescue, mountain search and rescue. And I remember an incident, Gareth, where we did a long line rescue of a climber who had fallen on a mountain face and fractured hips, fractured femur, very serious injuries. And he was in a place where the only way that we could get to him was by connecting a 60-foot and 40-foot long line under a 206 Jet Ranger helicopter. And the pilot, very, very experienced, skilled pilot, but this bothered me for weeks after this, that we were using a new technique, one that we'd never trained on and tested in. And the flying was done in a crosswind. There was approximately a 22-knot crosswind. And the limit for the 206 Jet Ranger for hovering in that condition was 17 knots was the limit. But the pilot made a decision to extend that range of wind and conducted the rescue in 22 knots. And it was a success. We got the injured climber off. And I remember at the bottom, the celebration, everybody had. But that was an incident that bothered me for a long time after that, because, and your article the title of it is exactly right. Were we lucky, or were we actually good? And there was an opportunity for learning from that we completely missed. And then the danger is, like you said, that where you said people behave the way they're rewarded. And I think for all of us involved in that incident, because we failed to learn from it, and not only did we fail to learn, there was a lot of congratulating going on, that it actually reinforced that risk, that acceptable risk behavior.
So there's some questions there from that story. So the difference between, so this is, one of the key bits is the need to reflect and debrief. So whilst the limit was 17 knots, what was the flight test envelope that it was cleared to? My background, I've got military aviation background. I did some flight trials work. I did some research and development work and systems engineering. So knowing that an aircraft certification requirements have got different levels of safety margins, what's an acceptable level of risk? So you would have the absolute envelope that basically said you can't operate the aircraft at all in that space, or you can't maintain a place over the ground, because of the controls. And that might be, I'm going to make some numbers up, that might be 27 knots crosswind. So basically said, no matter how experienced you are as a flight test pilot, you're never going to be able to operate inside those parameters. And then you might say, well, actually, the test pilots can operate to, say, 23 knots, and they're able to operate within that space. And then you've got the sort of the normal line pilots might be 17 knots, or there could be structural limitations between that, so you can't actually put the control authority in. So to me, again, it's quite easy to judge based on a perception of these are the limits. But what it does do to me is it prompts to say, yes, we could have been good because that pilot was was a Top Gun pilot that basically could nominate. He had the skills of a test pilot and was able to manage in that flight envelope. And therefore, what he perceived as the acceptable risk was inside the flight envelope of the aircraft, and they're not the same. But what it does is it means you've got to have a conversation. So you could say, and when I run simulations with a training that I'd run, it's computer-based simulations. I say to people, are you good or you're lucky? And it's like, oh yeah, we were good. All right, tell me, why were you good then? And you go, well, because of so-and-so. Well, or often they can't. And so to me, the definition between being lucky and good is, could you replicate it in the same circumstances, in the same scenarios? So it could be that that pilot would be able to replicate that. Now, it doesn't mean that he's not eroding the safety margins, because there is a flight envelope that's cleared for the operational space, and that will be made up for a whole bunch of reasons. So and that's the reason why I put that subtitle is, were you good or were you lucky? And you won't know it until you reflect. And that's why I was saying trying to define what a near miss is actually quite difficult, because we're heavily biased by outcome.
Right. And then in law enforcement, part of the difficulty or the situation contextually that makes that even more problematic is we're dealing with unpredictable human behavior. So, for example, we may conduct a high-risk traffic stop in a certain manner on a potentially armed individual in the vehicle. And if the individual cooperates and gives up, then that almost validates all of the tactics that we use. But then the question, like as you said, until you actually explore, well, what if? What would have happened if the individual would have done this or would have done that? Then the outcome would have gone on a different trajectory. And to your point, I think until you ask those very critical and important questions, you can't evaluate the quality of decision making. So, Gareth, in your article, you spoke about two different types of near misses that I think is very instructive. So maybe can you discuss what those two types of near misses are, and how would we differentiate between them?
And only if you tell me what the titles are, and I'll try and build on those.
Right. So there was one you mentioned about statistical risk and perceived risk.
Yeah. So the statistical risk is this piece where numerically you're going to look at the odds. You go and do a whole bunch of trials, and you say, right, that's your baseline risk, and it's potentially irreducible for what we're talking about. And then we have the perceived risk about what it is that I'm going to say the uncertainty rather than perceived risk. And that is heavily influenced by emotions, heuristics, previous experiences. And we're making the best assessment we can with previous mental models, schema, and pattern matching, and said, it looks like one of those, therefore it is one of those. And we build up our idea of what's an acceptable, I'm going to say you can't even quantify what that acceptable level of uncertainty is, because in real time you'll be going towards those goals. And as you talked about that traffic stop, thinking about how many different variables you're having to deal with and the uncertainties that are in place. And I think about how much margin of maneuver do you have, so that what's your, I'm going to say, your get out of jail card. And the problem is, from my experience, is that a lot of training systems are formulaic and they're very process driven, which means that your mental models, your schema, are very fixed and very, there is a limit to what you can do. And I understand why the system can't do it. Well, it doesn't do it, not that it can't do it. It's because it costs time and money. And in uncertain, complex environments, you can't have a tick box solution that says they did this and they did that. And you have to be able to create thinking that looks at the different variables, and you're trying to increase certainty or reduce uncertainty. So there's something that, the formulaic process will look at that fixed risk that's there and say, right, how do we bound that? But then the reality of the situation is every situation is going to be different. How do you learn from that? And I'm sure your listeners have heard of Gary Klein's naturalistic decision making, or recognition prime decision making. And how that built up those mental models is through debriefs and reflections. And in effect, and the how the organization supports that is it gives people time to debrief post a task. So they'll sit down and talk through those activities in a structured way and in a manner in which you can share stories. People might think, oh, they're just the war stories, but they are really about what people saw, what they heard, what they felt, what they smelt, the real sort of guttural bits that then stick in us, because those uncertainties are managed through emotions, not through logic. And so to me, that's the critical difference between what you could almost numerate and count and say, this is the risk. And then there's the whole bunch of variability that's out there.
So would an example then of, say, perceived risk be, so let's say we have an officer who has been involved in 6 high-speed pursuits where there's been no negative outcome from those pursuits. Nobody got killed, no serious injuries. And so they have a perception of the risk of that activity compared to an officer who maybe had a pursuit that ended tragically with maybe a civilian getting killed. And so would those then perceptions of risk be completely different because of, like you said, those biases, those implicit previous experiences?
Absolutely. And you could flip it the other way around and say, actually, somebody who's had not just an injury or an accident in the pursuit, but if an officer is being fired upon, then they're likely to be more conscious or more careful, more risk aware. I wouldn't say risk averse, because you wouldn't be doing the job you were doing if you were risk averse, but you'd be more potentially calculated, more defensive. And that means that you might actually introduce more risk into the situation to what's going on. And the whole perception of risk is not just what that officer perceives of them and their activity, but how others will perceive their activity as well. So what's the public perception of the police's behavior in certain scenarios? And that may not be consciously being processed, but it certainly will be subconsciously processed.
Right, absolutely. So how do we then think about learning from near misses, Gareth? Because I mean, this ultimately is the objective, is how do we as individuals and as organizations learn and share those lessons learned from near misses? In your article, you said that there's a problem, you identified a problem, and you said the problem is that we assume that we would actually recognize the circumstances prior to the event. And so I thought that was really interesting. Can you expand on that?
Yes. So there's a couple of bits. There's a number of biases that influence us looking back. So hindsight bias is one of them, where we misjudge the risk shift. So I'll make up some numbers. So it might be that you perceive a risk of something happening is 1 in 1,000 prior to the event, but afterwards you perceive it to be 1 in 20 or 1 in 50, because now you've got an outcome. So we don't know what to look for. So this bit of you don't know the risk is escalating as you go around. And what I would say is actually stop trying to learn from near misses and learn from normal work. So you don't have to, because if you say that you're going to go looking for near misses or learning from near misses, that means that you've got to recognize even after the event that you had a near miss. But actually, if you start looking at learning from normal activities, you'll expose the different perceptions of risks within those involved. And those could be the frontline officers, they could be the dispatch people, they could be the executives who are making the big sort of field decisions. So even, as I'm going to say, a successful operation has a huge amount to learn as long as you reflect on it. And so what I would say is, how do you learn from near misses? Forget near misses and learn from normal. Near misses, incidents, positive, negative, will all be captured in normal activity. Don't just run a debrief when something goes wrong. Run a debrief on normal stuff.
Perfect. And I guess, that goes back to this idea of the learning, trying to explore the quality of your decision making and we often say in law enforcement, we talk about decision making, we do use Gary Klein's recognition prime decision framework. But we often talk about, what was important, when did you see it, what did it mean when you did see it, and how did that impact your decision making? And because we in law enforcement often don't control the outcome. And I think that's, what really the public doesn't understand, and often the judiciary doesn't understand, is we're dealing with often unpredictable, dangerous human beings that they're the ones that will ultimately predict what the outcome of the event will be. And so we can't use the outcome of the incident as a measure of the quality of decision making.
Absolutely. And I think the other variable that's in there that shifts your the other parties, be it the criminal or whatever, is they will behave differently in a law enforcement situation than a normal person would. And this whole bit about predictably irrational. And I think that means that, from your training scenarios, it's that when you're trying to run training, you will probably be more predictable than your typical criminal adversary, alleged individual, whatever it is, the other parties, because you have an idea about how somebody would behave. And I'm pretty sure that when you go and interview your officers, you go, I couldn't believe they did this. That came right out of the blue. And it's this bit of, okay, so how often does that happen? And then you start sharing those stories. So you don't have to have, as you said, an adverse outcome. You could have a successful arrest in that it didn't end up critically going wrong, but actually there was a whole bunch of learning that happened in there that is odd, it's different. And importantly, it's looking at, if people judged it and placated the situation so it didn't end up as a catastrophic outcome, what was it that they picked up? And often they don't know. In the heat of the moment, they'll just go, I did my training, or it just didn't look quite right. And it takes a lot of, I'm going to say, digging into the stories to say, what was it that may have triggered their thought process? And invariably, organizations don't give people enough time to reflect and learn after an activity, because, from a point of, you've arrested, you've handed over the person to the police station, and now you're straight back out. Or you've got to go and write a report up, and then you go straight out. And there isn't an ability to reflect yourself or as part of a team, because when you have a multi-actor story, you're going to get conflicting information. And that isn't because people are lying, it's because people perceive differently and they match schema that's already there, and they will make sense with that. And each of those multiple actors will come up with a different story. So there is no one truth, and it's something I posted the other day. The public would like to think there is a single truth, but not when it comes to telling narratives. It's not because people are trying to hide things, although that can play into it because people don't want to unearth their vulnerability or the lack of knowledge or the lack of situational awareness or poor communications, all the stuff that's normal, because the police are held on a pedestal of excellence, the same as surgeons are, and the same as judges are, and the same as airline pilots are. They can't make mistakes because of where they are. Guess what? They're human. They make mistakes too.
Right. And interestingly, what do you think about, because in some of those industries, so for example, in firefighting, you're probably aware that there's a near miss capture system, non-punitive, called firefighter near miss. And I know in aviation, there's a near miss reporting system that's non-punitive. In medicine, there's near miss reporting systems that's non-punitive. And so I know you said, stop trying to worry about near misses, but obviously in some of these domains that they find that there's incredible value and learning from being able to capture these and understand the decision making and what led to these events happening. So, you know, why does that work in some industries seemingly effectively, or is that a myth? Am I wrong? Like they have these systems, but they're not working. What's your perspective on that?
So the perspective there is there are two purposes for a reporting system or reporting near misses. One is organizationally to capture data to talk about trends and develop interventions. So that's one level. The other level is at a much lower level, which is altruistic, looking out for my friends, my colleagues, and that goes through storytelling and sharing over a coffee or a beer what happened. And often those two things are quite different in the sorts of data you want to capture, the amount of time that's allocated to it. So aviation, the biggest ones, NASA's run aviation safety reporting system. So you can report an incident, and there isn't a definition of that other than this really open bit that basically said, compromise risk, it could have gone wrong, you captured it, let's learn. And that is embedded in culture that goes back probably 50 years, because they realized analyzing cockpit voice recorders, flight data recorders, prior to that, pilot was last to touch it, it was their fault, pilot error. And then they started to analyze this sort of data set and realized that actually through the cockpit voice recorders that the crew members knew that something wasn't quite right, but there was an ability to speak up and challenge it. So cockpit resource management was put together to help with communication and assertion. And then it became crew resource management, because back-end cabin crew were helping with that. And then it became maintenance and air traffic control. And everybody now realizes that actually understand our fallibility and let's share those stories. So you end up with something like aviation safety reporting system captures a whole bunch of data. It is funded, it's resourced, it's got training that's in there. And importantly, it provides a feedback mechanism to the operators. And there is a pull learning culture, not just a push learning culture. So that's, the preamble I was talking about, reporting systems are not just about having a letterbox that you can drop stuff into. There is a huge systems view that basically says we've got to trust it. We've got to know that it's going to be there for learning and it's not going to be used for punitive. It's got to be resourced. It's going to be analyzed. And there has to be something that feeds back. The fire service, the Wildland Fire Service have a great learning review process. And that shifted about 8 years ago from Serious Accident Investigation Committee, which was very much a punitive approach, to a learning focused approach, when actually they would build learning products based on the stakeholders. So the report that would be produced would be different, or learning product would be different for, say, the executive, for the fire commander, for the local supervisor, for the insurance, or for the frontline operator. So they would sit there and say, what is it that people need? And so people would gain value from the reporting system because it would come back and give them learning, which would encourage them to submit something back. So if you don't have a reciprocal approach, it's not going to work. Healthcare sort of has it. It has anonymous systems to capture it, but often they just disappear into the black hole and you don't close the loop the other way. So people sit there and go, you know what, it takes me X amount of time and effort to fill in a report, and I'm going to submit it and nobody does anything with it. Nothing changes, so why bother? So that there's a whole sort of systems view of why near miss reporting doesn't work in some spaces. So I then go to the other bit of what's the purpose of reporting? If it's about improving performance of local teams, then actually you don't need a formal reporting system to capture this. All you need is a culture and a time that says all you need is a culture that says, let's learn from these things and tell the stories. The downside of having small team learning is that the team in that police department in that city will face the same problems as that team and that team and that team. And that's the the bigger difficulty or the bigger challenge is how do you get cross-team learning happening? Because inter-team might, or even, even at a shift level within a police station or a police department, you're going to have rivalries, you're going to have tribalism. One shift won't want to talk to another one about mistakes that have happened that they've recovered from, because there's a pride thing, there's a tribalism that happens. And so they have to break down that tribe and say, you know what, and aviation again does that fairly well, because they realize that you're never going to make all the mistakes yourself. So there is definitely an altruistic approach that says, you know what, I can learn from somebody else's mistakes because I'm never going to make them all myself. But that culturally says, I will make a mistake at some point. And that a lot of their training is based around that. Whereas I think police and healthcare is, and I would put in this similar situation, your training is likely to be around, you are the best that's out here. You put people on a pedestal of excellence, and society expects you to be perfect, and you're not. That was a long one, sorry.
No, that was great. And I think one of the things that also complicates it in the training context in law enforcement, and I don't know if this is unique, Gareth, to law enforcement, but we largely do not have a learning environment that embraces mistakes, that embraces the ability to save so as a trainer, for example, to have a culture that says, look, this is a training environment where we are going to put you in very difficult situations into, as Robert Bjork talks about, desirable difficulties. We're going to push you to the limits of your skill, and we will expect you to struggle. We'll expect you to make mistakes. We'll expect you to have to problem solve. And not only is that expected, but that's celebrated, because that's where the best learning is going to take place. But we often don't have that culture. We have, like you said, a very punitive type of learning culture where perfection is the standard. Don't admit when you've made a mistake. If you have a near miss and you know it, keep your mouth shut, because if you do speak up, all that's going to happen is you're going to be punished for it and disciplined for it. And so then how do we, Gareth, what kind of things could an agency or can trainers do if let's say we have a push culture right now and we want to move more? How do we go from a push culture to a pull culture where our students, where our officers want to embrace those opportunities for learning and share those experiences and learn from them? Do you have some strategies that we could employ?
I suppose that the first bit is take the jeopardy away from learning. And by that, I mean, you're not being judged on your competence. So the training that I operate with high-risk teams is about, it's space-based computer simulation. Nobody can bring any prior knowledge into the training environment about how to use this interpersonal skills lab training system. So that means that everybody comes in at ground zero. They're going to learn that failure is normal. And most of my training is around non-technical skills. So decision-making, situation awareness, communication, teamwork, leadership, followership, and understanding the impact of stress and fatigue and other performance-shaping factors. So we put people in an environment where it doesn't matter if you fail, that people have a laugh because people make these silly mistakes. And what we're doing is conceptually showing the value of brief, plan, brief, execute, debrief, and then plan and brief. And it's a very intense period over a short number of days, small number of days. And then people have just got really, for want of a better term, indoctrinated into the value of learning. And I've done that in healthcare. I've done it in oil and gas. I've done it in dive teams. I've done it in software teams. It doesn't matter what environment they're in, because actually you are lowering that gradient. And we start the day and say, look, you're not going to, if you pass on the first mission, it's more luck than judgment. But, great, we'll talk about it. But we have a real structured debrief process that looks at, amongst other things, 8 questions, really. What did we do well and why? What do we need to improve on and how we're going to do it? What did the team do well and why? And what do the team need to improve on and how they're going to do it? And the most important questions are not the what did we do well and what do we need to improve? It's why did it go well and how are we going to improve it? And that requires a lot more thought because the observations are relatively easy. And the other piece is focusing on specifics, not generalities. Oh yeah, the teamwork was good. All right, tell me what was good about the teamwork. Give me an example of where it happened and how it developed. How did you see the situation going wrong? What were the cues that were there? And what can you then spot next time? And that really is about, again, goes back to this quality of the decision making. What we're looking for is context and precursor factors that people will pick up and say, that's something that might match this pattern. And so it's that pattern matching before the event, because when the event's happened, it's too late. I know one of my contacts probably know Lou Hayes Jr. talks about this left of bang and right of bang. The learning happens left of bang, not right of bang. And it's this bit that says, how do you spot the situation developing? And that means in the training environment, you have to be really creative in picking things that are not quite normal, that are different. And as an example of that, just this evening, so immediately prior to this, I was running a training session, or I was a student in a training session for the tool that I deliver. So the trainer running a new version of the software, and he got us to run a scenario, which 8 of us were there. We were 2 teams of 4 people, and he described it as this mission. And we all had a mental model about what's going to happen in this mission. And so the simulation, it's only 10 minutes, started, and we start getting information, and bits fail, and we've still got an idea about what should be happening. And we were trying to solve a problem that's common to the missions that we already know, Venus A and B and C. We know what's going to happen. So we were trying to solve the problem, getting ahead of the game. And the problem didn't materialize. Another problem did. And actually, we locked ourselves out of solving the problem because we preempted the wrong thing and we'd missed some critical information. And so we then sat, it's a 10-minute mission. We talked for 40 minutes after that 10-minute session about how we made those decisions and what led into that. Now, that's easy. You know, we're in a training environment. We don't have the time and the commercial pressures. But if you're in a training setup, it's this bit that almost give people the cues to lead to a bum decision against the scenario that you've developed. And then you can explore this piece of, okay, was there anything else that may have given you a clue that the situation was developing a different way? And asking it in a structured manner in a deep, somebody else in the team goes, yeah, I picked up on that. I picked up that something was different. Okay, so then the question is, without being too negative, why didn't you say something? Or because I didn't perceive it to be relevant, or the last time I spoke up, I got put down. So there's a whole bunch of social and peer reasons why people won't speak up. But if you're able to do it in a training environment where there's no jeopardy, you can get some of these biases out. And I don't know how your training systems work, but I'm guessing, again, we go back to what's rewarded. Do people pass the class, or do they treat it as a learning environment? And just again, from the trainer's point of view, I try to explain to my trainers who then go out and teach my materials, when you go into a training environment as the facilitator, the educator, you're a leader of a learning team. And that means that you should be learning too from your students. So we as a learning team are both going to learn from each other. Whereas actually a lot of training is delivered, I'm going to teach you what I know, and the purpose of this course is for you to pass the class. Well, if that's the case, there's no incentive for the instructor to learn from the situation about what's going on. So that leadership and role modeling is incredibly powerful as well, because now actually the leader can turn around and go, well, you know what, I made a mistake here. And on day 1 of the missions that we run, the instructor talks about failures because they will facilitate 3 missions. They will talk about mistakes that they made on those 3 training sessions, which they were facilitating, which is a bit odd. Why would the instructor talk about their mistakes? or because you set the scene about learning straight away, and then you get them to run the debriefs the following day. So hopefully that's giving some ideas.
Yeah, that's excellent. And I guess one of the things, like from your example that you just gave there in law enforcement, because we have the big formal training environments where we run full scenarios and all that, but every day on a shift, when officers show up for work and they run the briefing at the beginning of their shift, or what's called a parade, the supervisor could easily be doing a short tabletop exercise or show a portion of a video, but stop it, because often what we do with videos, Gareth, of an incident is we just show the whole video from start to finish. So then you know the outcome, you're way right of bang, and then you say, okay, now let's talk about it. And I think most of the learning value is gone from that. So to your point, if you were to show a portion of a video just with a little bit of critical information, then stop it, and then have people in pairs or in small teams have those conversations, a structured conversation that was facilitated. I think, to your point, if you used your example, you could have a lot of valuable learning take place.
Totally. And there's another way of doing it as well. One of the tutors at Lund University, where I'm studying, runs things called local rationality investigations. And what he does is he runs a scenario for basically to show people the value of local rationality investigation. How did it make sense for all of the stakeholders to do what they did? And so he runs a little exercise where he takes a complex story and simplifies it into quite a judgmental piece, where it's quite easy to spot where the rules have been broken, where it would be easy to jump to a conclusion. And so he tells this narrative and then says, was that behavior acceptable? Would you allow them to go back to work tomorrow? And do you think there's other learning or this sort of thing happens elsewhere? And you have a dialogue, explain why do people make those decisions, and then you tell the context-rich story, the locally rational story, which follows exactly the same trajectory, but now you have the context. And now you say to people, right, now do you think that's acceptable? So you can do it two ways. You can take little bits out and say, what happens next? What happens next? Why do you think it? Or you can really smack somebody in the face with the truth that's there by basically getting them to make a really direct judgment, quick judgment about an event where you don't have enough information, which in effect is what the public do. It's what the media do. It's potentially what supervisors do when they don't. All they hear is the 6-second snip of, and this is what happened. You sit there and go, oh, what? And they then immediately jump into that emotional response. Then you can look at the reconstruction with the multi-actor timelines and the different stories that are there. And now you sit there going, oh, right. So these are the things that are happening. But for both of those stories, you've got to understand the context behind it. So even if you show snippets of video, the problem with video is you don't get the thought process behind the actors in the video often, unless that person is there and can give the debrief as you go along. So it's great to play the what if game, but that doesn't necessarily help them understand the decision making that took place in the video narrative.
I think one of the things we try to do, we should try to do when we do that, is provide some context for the video that you're about to see. I want you to put yourself in the position of the officer. This is what you know. Or you're going to watch 15 or 20 seconds of video, and I'm going to stop it, and then I'm going to ask you, what did you see? What was important? And if you were there, what would you assess the risk at, and what decisions would you be making at this point? And so because you're right, I think one of the things that we're so good at is judging the behavior of our peers. But the objective of that type of learning should be, we're not focused on the decision-making of the officer in the video. We're looking at you putting yourself in that position at this point in time. And then we're going to talk about, those cues, those important cues, how did those impact your schema and your risk assessments? So in your article, you spoke about and you briefly mentioned it here as well, the importance of a debrief. And I loved
Mm,
in your article, Gareth, you have a debrief model, and you say here that although it's really hard not to, we shouldn't take things for granted when they go right. Rather, we need to understand why it went right in the manner it did, and the best way to do that is via a debrief. And you have a debrief model there that
mhm.
basically has several steps to it, and each letter of the debrief is
It means something, yeah.
means something. So can you walk us through that? Because I think that's
Yeah.
one of the things we often struggle with in law enforcement, because we know debriefings are really important. We know they are, and we know we should be doing them as soon after an incident as possible so that we can pull out as much of the learning as possible. But often we struggle with structure. How would we do that? So as a frontline supervisor, I show up at a scene, and let's say I'm going to do a hot wash debrief
Yep.
right there at the event, because to your earlier point, we've got calls waiting. These officers have to get in their cars and go to the next call and deal with the next problem. But can we take 5 minutes or 10 minutes right here and let's do a hot wash? So can you walk us through that debrief framework?
Yeah, sure. And you know, you've already bound the first piece, so that the debrief model follows the word debrief. So I'll go through the framework, and then I'll talk about how you could do it in something like 10 minutes. So D is define the aims and goals of the mission. Did we succeed them? And what's the scope of the debrief in terms of time? So in this case, we say, right, we've got 10 minutes to debrief this. E is an example, and this is where the leader of the activity, the leader of the debrief, creates psychological safety by talking about a mistake or an error that they made on that particular task. And the purpose there is to actually try and lower this authority gradient and create vulnerability within the team. And that's difficult, I get that. Then we talk about basics, which is almost the pre-execution bit, planning, briefing before we went out the door. Did we set ourselves up for success or failure? R is a small r because it's about reviewing the timeline. And often if we want to improve performance, team performance, the timeline doesn't have much to add other than it might provide some anchor points to bring learning together. And then we talk about the I and the E. The I is the internal learning. What did I do well and why? What do we need to improve on and how? And the E is the team learning. What did the team do well and why? What does the team need to improve on and how they're going to do it? And then we would talk about F, which is fix, file, follow-up. Basically, what are you going to do with the lessons that have identified and moving on? So if you've got 10 minutes to basically do a quick wash up, I would simplify that and basically say, let's create vulnerability. So the leader, the supervisor says, right, going to have a debrief here, got 10 minutes, successful outcome. We've, apprehended the suspect or whatever, or we haven't, but we've only got 10 minutes. I missed this critical factor here. Just to set the scene about learning, I missed X, Y, and Z because of X, Y, and Z. And it's not finding an excuse. It might be because it's about task loading or workload or line of sight issues. But what we talk about here is now we've set it up. And then I would go into the I's and the E's. What did I do well as the supervisor here? Talk about it quickly. And then what do I need to improve on and how am I going to do it? And then go individually around the team. And I don't know how big your teams are that you're going to do that, because if you've got 6 or 7 people in 10 minutes, you're probably only going to be able to do what did we as a team do well, why, what do we as a team need to improve on, and how we're going to do that. But if you've got a smaller group, maybe 3 or 4 people, then you could do I and E. But the critical questions, if it's the team environment, what did we do well as a team and why? What do we need to improve on and how? And I purposely framed that as what do we need to improve as opposed to what did we do wrong? Because if we just identify on the wrongs, that doesn't actually help us. It's really easy to look back and go, well, that was rubbish, we missed this. So what? What we need to do is turn it around and say, there's the observation, how do we fix it? And put concrete pieces in. And I would end the debrief with the F, which is nominating actors to address things. So it's very easy to finish a debrief and go, yeah, great, move on. But actually there was some stuff that definitely needed to be done. So get somebody to own it. And that could be the person who's running the debrief. And I would also say, write it down. in some form or another. It could be just a voice note on a phone, or it could be just typed in a to-do list, but capture that, because in the heat of the moment, when you go somewhere else, that learning will be lost. And that brings me on to a point, the difference between lessons learned and lessons identified. Many organizations have got loads of lessons identified, but they have far fewer lessons learned. And the difference being, you have put something in place and you have measured the change of that intervention. And that is then the lesson learned. Otherwise, it's just a lesson. Sorry, it's a lesson learned when the change has been measured. Otherwise, it's just lessons identified.
Excellent. Well, I love that framework, and I think that would be very helpful. It's easy to remember. And like you said, if you even have a short period of time, if you're, say it,
you can do this yourself.
Right, exactly. So as a frontline supervisor, as a street sergeant, you could go through this yourself. If you had a small number of officers, 2 officers or 4 officers at a call, you could do a hot wash where you could go through it. If you're short on time, so you said if you're really short on time, you may only be able to do the team lessons. Would there be value in, okay, we only have 10 minutes, but could we encourage the individuals after that to do that reflection on the individual, the performance, and then have a follow-up with them? So if I'm a team sergeant, I could do that hot wash, do the debrief, but then say at the end of the shift, I could connect with each one of those officers and say, hey, what did you come up with when you reflected internally on your own performance there? Give me 1 or 2 things. Yeah.
Absolutely. And then the key then is actually trying to build and aggregate those, because it might be that you've got a whole bunch of regular things that we need to improve on and how we do them. So that, to me is the leadership role. If they're going to start collecting individual improvement activities and team improvement activities, they might be able to pick up something that is above their level, in terms of, they're operating at this team level. So actually, how do we fix this at a much wider level? But I think, the self-reflection and the sort of self-coaching side, definitely, just sit there with a voice note. Now, this is, I don't know, this is my unknowns piece. In the UK, a couple of years ago, a doctor's personal reflective notes were used in evidence in court when she'd made a mistake. Now, I can see potentially, and I don't know whether or not you have your own reflective notes and they are protected or not, but I can see that might be a limiting factor for doing self-reflection.
Right. And that is an issue. I mean, it's not uncommon for officers in our agencies. For example, in my agency, I know we had a very significant event, an active shooter in a community that was a very sentinel, high-risk event, but we were unable to do a formal debrief on that call for over 2 years because of all of the litigation and the liability and everything around for the organization. There's so much fear around, well, can we even talk about this? And so the problem is when the liability piece becomes the trump card, then all of that learning gets lost. And unfortunately, that's an issue that needs to be overcome for sure.
Totally. I mean, there's a phrase from Todd Conklin of, you can blame or you can learn, you can't do both. And the bit here, and people go, yes, you can. So the problem is when you blame, people close up. And when you learn, you want to find all of the context-rich stories that went into that. What are the adaptations, the modifications, the gap? What does work as done look like? Because it's not the same as work as imagined, the stuff that's written down. And a proper learning investigation will be about finding out what normal looks like. And that's the other advantage about learning from normal work, is you can start to create the learning out there. You're not, I'm hoping, don't have very many bad outcomes. And as a consequence, your learning opportunity from a good outcome is not going to be as negatively impacted by litigation and fear as learning from a negative outcome. So, and if you are able to verbally share stories without writing stuff down, that helps the small team. It might not help the big team and the bigger department or the, you know, the state, but it can certainly help the local team, because what you're trying to do is get into the habit of learning.
Right. And I love your point there. And I think that's the big takeaway I wouldn't want the audience to lose is, you know, if as part of the warp and woof of our agency culture, that when we are, all of the work that we're doing, so not just the stuff that goes bad or the stuff that we have near misses on, but all of these events that we do on a regular basis every day, if it's part of our culture to do these hot washes, to do these debriefs and learn from all of them, then it really shouldn't be that huge of an issue when we do have that one rare sentinel event that, because of all of the other liability concerns and everything else, we have to put it in a box for a while. But the issue is, are we learning from our everyday work? I love that point, and I think that should be the takeaway for the listeners.
Totally. And it's a huge mind shift, because it's this recognition that even when we get good outcomes, there will be some errors, some deviations, some adaptations, some modifications that go on. And many of your listeners will have heard of normalization of deviance. And realistically, it's normalization of risk, which is a normal human behavior. When we get rewarded for positive outcomes, when somebody doesn't ask the question, how did you do that? In a curious way, not a judgmental way.
Right. Absolutely. Well, Gareth, we're coming up on an hour already. I can't believe how fast that went. Great conversation. But where can our listeners go? Like if they want to learn more about conducting good debriefs, or understanding how to create a culture of a learning poll, learning organization, can you offer some advice, some recommendations on resources, websites, your website?
Yeah, sure.
Where can people go?
So an easy one would be my website, thehumandiver.com. And there's a blog on there which has got loads of articles, which, you know, Chris, you've been talking about a couple of them, you know, so humandiver.com/blog. The debrief model that we were just talking about is available to download from that site as well. So thehumandiver.com/debrief. And I don't know whether or not you've got an opportunity to have show notes. If so, I can send you the PDF and you can stick that on there, or put the links in there as well. I would also say a lot of this is based around psychological safety and just culture and understanding human error. So I would recommend getting hold of a book called The Field Guide to Understanding Human Error by Sidney Dekker. That provides a very simple view of understanding. There we go. That's it. I was going to say that looks like it's a great book.
It is.
Amy Edmondson's Fearless Organization is another one about psychological safety. And the book that I've written, just as I'm rubbish at plugging it, so I'm going to plug it anyway, Under Pressure, it's about diving, but it's got 30 plus diving stories in there, and the theory is wrapped around the stories that are there. The stories explain the theory, and it's a relatively easy read, and it just brings the stuff to life. And I know there's lots of people in non-diving space who read the book because of the sort of the stories are interesting, but also because it brings the theory to life.
Right. Excellent. Thank you, Gareth. And can they get that book at your website, or is that available on Amazon? Or
yeah, so they can get the book on the website if you want a signed copy. Otherwise, Amazon, Kindle, Audible. So yeah, it's available in ebook format and Audible as well. So
excellent. Well, Gareth, thanks again for making the time and for having this great conversation.
Thank you. It's been great.
Look forward to having you on again. Thank you.
Totally. Thanks so much, Chris, and thank you.